Frank Costello was not born into silk. He was born into dirt, brick dust, and the stale stench of a tenement hallway in East Harlem, 1891. Back then, the neighborhood was a patchwork of Italians, Irish, and Jews, each one suspicious of the other, each one fighting for their scrap of the city. His father came over from Calabria, a man with rough hands and no patience for American dreams. He pushed a cart. He worked until his back curved like a question mark. Frank watched him grind himself into the grave and decided, before his voice even deepened, that sweat and labor were for suckers. The streets gave him a different education. He learned quick that fists were currency, but brains could buy more than blood ever could. By 12, Costello was running errands for local gamblers. By 15, he was slipping envelopes under doors, cash folded neat, for people who didn't want their windows smashed or their bones broken. It wasn't called the mafia yet, not in the way newspapers would later scream it, but the structure was already there. A web, a quiet empire built on silence and fear. He learned early the difference between the toughs and the bosses. The toughs swaggered, shouted, waved guns. The bosses spoke soft, smiled like gentlemen, and never carried their own bullets. That stuck with him. If you had to announce power, you didn't have it. Prohibition hit like a lightning strike in 1920, and for every politician in Washington wagging his finger, there were 100 Frank Costellos filling bottles in basements and shipping crates in the dark. It was a gold rush without shovels, just trucks, bribes, and bullets. Costello didn't drink much himself, but he understood the hunger of men. Thirst wasn't about liquor. It was about escape. And escape was something he could sell. He had the knack for making enemies disappear without blood in the streets. Sure, people still ended up in the East River with their pockets full of rocks, but when it was Costello's order, the papers never linked it. His name was clean enough to be whispered in smoke-filled rooms at City Hall. Judges knew him, senators knew him, some owed him, some feared him. Most were both. By the mid-1930s, he was no longer just a bootlegger or a bookmaker. He was a broker of influence. His real weapon wasn't the pistol. It was the handshake. When Lucky Luciano was taken down and deported, it was Costello who slid into the empty seat without a war. No fireworks, no pile of bodies, just quiet maneuvering. Quiet, but absolute. They called him the Prime Minister of the Mob. And it wasn't a joke. In a city where gangsters bled each other dry for territory, Costello operated like a politician, one who could buy mayors, bend laws, and still walk down Fifth Avenue in a tailored suit without a single cop daring to stop him. But quiet power makes loud enemies. Behind the polished veneer, there were men who saw him as too soft, too willing to compromise with outsiders, too polite for the streets that had made him. They mistook civility for weakness. It would be their first mistake. The city was changing. The money was bigger, the risks sharper. Costello knew the danger wasn't in the gang wars. It was in the shifting alliances, the whispers in back rooms, the smiles that didn't reach the eyes. The next decade would not be kind to men who believed they were untouchable. And Frank Costello, for all his cunning, was about to learn just how fragile a crown could be. Prohibition was not just a law, it was an open invitation to every man with enough guts, cunning, and connections to see the opportunity. For Frank Costello, it was the perfect stage. He didn't see it as bootlegging. He saw it as running a business in an America that didn't yet understand its own hypocrisy. The politicians made speeches about morality, but after the applause faded, they drank in private. And that contradiction, that wide gap between what men said and what they did, was where Frank thrived. By 1921, he had already linked arms with some of the sharpest operators in the underworld. There was Charlie Lucky Luciano, the ambitious, cold-eyed strategist who could talk to Sicilians in the old language and to Irish cops in the new one. There was Meyer Lansky, the numbers genius who understood odds the way priests understood scripture. And there was Frank, who could walk into a room full of bankers and gangsters and leave with both groups feeling like they had won. The whiskey ran from Canada in trucks and trains, sometimes in crates marked machine parts, sometimes in barrels hidden under shipments of fresh produce. Frank's routes were clean, the drivers loyal. He didn't just pay them. He made sure their families were looked after, their debts quietly erased. It wasn't charity. It was insurance. You don't rat on the man who keeps your children fed. Still, the business wasn't without blood. Rival crews fought over supply chains like wolves over a carcass. Some favored intimidation, blowing up trucks, hijacking shipments, leaving bodies in alleys. Frank preferred another method. If a rival wanted territory, Frank bought him out or made him an offer to join the network. If they refused, Frank didn't need to pull a trigger. He just made a few calls, and suddenly, that rival found his truck stopped by the police, his suppliers refusing to sell, his bank accounts mysteriously frozen. In the underworld, dying wasn't the worst thing that could happen to a man. By the mid-1920s, the Costello-Lansky Lucky axis had influence stretching from the docks of New York to speakeasies in Chicago and Miami. Frank's personal specialty became the slot machine racket. It was clean, reliable, and, most importantly, legal in certain jurisdictions. He filled bars, diners, and back rooms with them, taking a cut of every nickel dropped into the shiny chrome mouths. In New Orleans, he partnered with the political machine to make sure the police looked the other way. It wasn't about the machines themselves, it was about what they represented: control. A man with a slot machine in his bar wasn't just making extra cash, he was part of the Costello network. And if that man's nephew got into trouble, if his business license was threatened, Frank could make a phone call and make the problem vanish. That kind of power couldn't be measured in dollars. Frank's relationship with politicians deepened during this period. He understood them better than they understood themselves. They wanted to believe they were in charge, that they could take money from the mob and still keep their hands clean. Frank played along. He sent them expensive gifts for their wives, funded their campaigns, and made sure they were photographed shaking his hand in public. It was a subtle warning. If I go down, you go with me. One of his most effective techniques was hosting quiet dinners in private rooms at the Waldorf or the Stork Club. The guest list was always mixed: judges, city council members, businessmen, and a few associates from the street. Over drinks, the lines between law and crime blurred. By the end of the night, a judge might find himself laughing with a man he'd later pretend not to recognize in court. While other mob bosses wore their criminality like a badge, Frank wore respectability like armor. He didn't shout. He didn't drink heavily. He dressed in tailored suits and tipped everyone generously, from the maitre d' to the elevator operator. It made him hard to hate, even for those who knew exactly what he was. But the streets never stopped moving, and neither did the threats. Dutch Schultz, a volatile and violent figure, began eyeing the numbers racket that Lansky controlled and the political influence Frank wielded. Schultz didn't care for diplomacy. He preferred to bulldoze his way into a territory, leaving bodies and headlines in his wake. Frank saw him for what he was: a liability to the delicate balance they'd built. Tensions escalated quietly at first: a shipment here, a payoff there. Then, in 1935, Schultz made the mistake of plotting to kill Special Prosecutor Thomas Dewey, a man already making his name busting organized crime. Luciano and Costello both understood that killing Dewey would bring the full weight of the government down on them. Schultz didn't care. That was his final miscalculation. When Schultz was gunned down in a Newark chop house, no one doubted that the Commission, Organized Crime's ruling council, had given the green light. Frank didn't fire the shots, but he had voted for them. It was another quiet lesson in how he operated: the removal of a problem without public mess. As the decade turned, Costello's influence reached a level few could match. He was making millions, but more importantly, he was making rules. In an underworld still haunted by the ghosts of the old Black Hand days, random extortion, sloppy hits, unnecessary wars, Frank was helping shape a modern syndicate, one with order, with structure, with something resembling discipline. But power always attracts the wrong kind of attention. Law enforcement began sniffing around his businesses, not because they had solid evidence, but because his name kept coming up in connection with powerful people. District attorneys hated the idea that a man like Costello could have dinner with a judge and walk away with a favorable ruling. Federal agents, too, had started building case files, not on bootlegging anymore, but on gambling, racketeering, and political corruption. Frank knew how to handle heat. He gave interviews to friendly reporters, downplaying his role in the mob. "I'm just a businessman," he'd say, smiling politely. "I run legitimate enterprises." The public ate it up. In a city still reeling from the Depression, people didn't mind a man who could make money, especially if he spread it around. But behind the scenes, cracks were forming. Younger, hungrier mobsters looked at Costello's methods and saw softness. They didn't understand that diplomacy was just another weapon. They wanted faster money, bigger scores, more headlines. And in the shadows, one of those young men, Vito Genovese, was already imagining what it would be like to take the prime minister's crown. For now, Costello remained untouchable. He had the mayor's ear, the governor's respect, and the police commissioner's quiet cooperation. But history has a way of turning on the very people it elevates. And as Frank would soon learn, it's not the enemies you see coming that destroy you, it's the ones who sit at your table, smiling, while they sharpen the knife. The 1940s should have been Frank Costello's golden decade. The war had pulled half the country's young men overseas, and the home front was a ripe garden for anyone with money, manpower, and the right kind of muscle. Gambling dens thrived, liquor flowed freely again, and the old bootlegging routes now carried heroin and other imports for those who knew where to look. But shadows were lengthening around the prime minister, and one of them had a name: Vito Genovese. Vito had been around for years, a former ally under Luciano, a man who'd done dirty work without flinching. He lacked Frank's polish, but he had ambition that could eat through steel. In '37, when Genovese caught a murder charge, he'd conveniently relocated to Italy, where Mussolini's regime treated him like visiting royalty. War changed the math. By '44, the Allies were in Rome, and Vito slipped back into the States. Murder charges had mysteriously evaporated, witnesses gone or silent. He came home hungry. Costello knew the type. He'd seen it before in street gangs. The kid who starts out sweeping the club's floors, learns to carry envelopes, then one day thinks he should own the place. Vito wasn't subtle about it either. He'd tell people in back rooms and smoky bars that Frank was getting too comfortable, too soft, too friendly with politicians. "This ain't no tea party," Vito would sneer. "This is business, and business don't need manners." Frank heard the whispers. He always did. But he didn't move too quickly. Never did. He believed in timing. Acting too soon turned a potential nuisance into a public feud. And Frank hated public feuds. They left trails. Instead, he tightened his grip on his power base. Slot machines remained his bread and butter, but he expanded into the racing wire service, a network that fed horse racing results to bookies across the country. Whoever controlled the wire controlled the bets, and whoever controlled the bets controlled the gamblers, the bookies, and the flow of cash. The move wasn't without resistance. The wire service was partly in the hands of a Chicago outfit, and they didn't appreciate Costello muscling in. But Frank knew how to apply pressure without drawing blood in the street. Meetings were arranged, partnerships were offered. He took a smaller cut than he might have demanded, just enough to get in the door. The rest, he knew, would come later. It always did. But Genovese was patient too, and he had his own network. He played to the men in the shadows who felt Costello's charm was wasted on politicians. These were the old-school types who still thought the mob's strength was measured in bullets, not ballots. They remembered the Black Hand days with a kind of nostalgia, days when fear came in the form of a hand-delivered note and a sawed-off shotgun, not a handshake in a cigar lounge. The war years gave Genovese room to move. Men were distracted. The military needed contacts overseas, and certain arrangements were made. Ships given safe passage, certain supplies mysteriously overlooked by customs. Genovese made himself useful to the wrong kind of people, and that usefulness translated into favors owed. Frank, meanwhile, kept working his political game. Judges, senators, state assemblymen, his Rolodex could have doubled as a government directory. He wasn't just bribing them, he was building alliances, the kind that kept him out of prison when others in the mob were falling like dominoes. But in 1946, Luciano was released from prison and deported to Italy. It was a symbolic moment. The old boss, the architect of the modern syndicate, was gone from American soil for good. In his absence, the balance shifted. Frank, as acting head, had to steer the commission through post-war turbulence, and not everyone liked his style. Genovese, back from Italy and full of stories about his service to the old country, began testing the boundaries. The first sign of real trouble came in the form of lost territory. A bookmaker in East Harlem who'd been loyal to Frank suddenly switched allegiances. Then another in the Bronx. It wasn't about the money. It was about the insult. These men had been under Costello's umbrella for years. Now they were paying tribute to Vito. It was a quiet declaration of war. Frank called a meeting. Not a full commission sit-down. He didn't want to make it that formal, but enough key figures to send a message. They met at a private room in the Waldorf. The air was thick with cigar smoke, the table heavy with wine and antipasto. Frank arrived last, as always, letting his presence settle the room before he spoke. "I hear some of you've been listening to fairy tales," he said softly, pouring himself a drink. "Stories about how I'm getting old, how I've forgotten the street, how maybe I'm better suited for country clubs than clubs of another kind." No one answered. They never did at first. Frank took a slow sip, eyes moving from face to face. "You want to do business? We do business. You want to talk loyalty? We can talk loyalty. But don't ever mistake my way of doing things for weakness. You think I can't put a man in the ground, same as any of you?" He leaned forward, voice dropping. "Ask around." The point landed. For now, the bleeding stopped. The defectors stayed put, maybe out of fear, maybe because they were reminded just how far Frank's reach went. But Genovese wasn't done. By 47, Vito was working angles in the narcotics trade. Frank had always steered clear of dope. It brought too much heat, too many long prison sentences. But heroin money was fast, and it pulled men like a magnet. Younger soldiers, impatient for the slow burn of Costello's rackets, started looking at Vito like the future. It was in those years that Frank began to sense the change in the air. The post-war America was not the one he'd risen in. The politicians were more cautious, the press more aggressive, the public more skeptical. The Senate had started holding hearings on organized crime, grandstanding in Frank's view, but dangerous nonetheless. A single photograph in the wrong paper, a single line from a witness, could undo years of careful image building. Still, he played the part. In public, he was the urbane businessman, the man who attended charity events and spoke politely to reporters. In private, he was reinforcing alliances, making sure every dollar of tribute came in on time, making sure the wire service stayed under his thumb. And somewhere in the middle of all this, Genovese made his first direct move. It wasn't a bullet, it was a proposition. One of Frank's longtime lieutenants, a man named Willie Moretti, was approached quietly. The pitch was simple. When the time came, when the seat at the head of the table opened, Willie should remember who'd offered him a bigger cut, more freedom, and a promise of running things the old way. Moretti laughed it off when he told Frank about it, but Costello didn't laugh. He knew that kind of pitch didn't happen in isolation. It was part of a pattern, a probe, testing the fence for weak spots. For the first time in years, Frank began moving pieces not just to grow, but to defend. He shored up alliances with Lansky and other key figures. He made quiet inquiries about Genovese's operations, building a file in his mind. And in moments alone, behind closed doors, Frank Costello, the prime minister of the mob, began to think about something he rarely considered: what it would take to survive if he wasn't the one in charge anymore. Because in the underworld, as in politics, power was never permanent, and Vito Genovese wasn't going to stop until he had the crown, or until someone buried him deep enough that even his ambition couldn't dig him back out. By 1950, the air in New York's underworld had changed. It wasn't just about making money anymore. It was about survival. And survival meant knowing which way the tide was turning before it swept you under. Frank Costello had been riding the crest for more than 2 decades, but the waves were getting choppy, and somewhere out there, Vito Genovese was building the kind of storm that could sink anyone. Genovese's methods were nothing like Frank's. He didn't wine and dine politicians. He didn't bother with the press. His strategy was simple: take control of the most lucrative rackets, and anyone who got in the way got buried. The heroin trade was his bread and butter now, and it was pulling in millions faster than slot machines or horse betting ever could. Frank watched it happen with a mixture of contempt and unease. Contempt because he considered the drug trade sloppy and dangerous. Unease because money talks in the mob, and Genovese's money was starting to turn heads. Young soldiers and mid-level captains, the ones who didn't remember the bootlegging days, were drifting toward Vito's camp. The old loyalty to Costello was eroding, replaced by the kind of greed that didn't care who was running the show as long as the envelopes were fat. The politicians, too, were changing. The old guard Frank had cultivated, men who'd take his calls at midnight, who'd make problems vanish without paperwork, were dying, retiring, or getting swept up in new anti-corruption campaigns. The Kefauver Committee hearings in 1950 and 51 were a public spectacle, dragging organized crime out of the shadows and into the glare of television cameras. Frank hated it. He hated the idea of men like Senator Estes Kefauver, turning the mob into a circus act for the benefit of their political careers. But he couldn't ignore it. Subpoenas were flying. Names were being named, and the press was eating it up. When Costello was finally called to testify in 1951, he made a decision. He would appear, but he would give them nothing. No names, no admissions, no flashy lines for the newspapers. Just quiet, polite refusals. The televised footage became famous, not for what Frank said, but for what he didn't. The camera, at his request, stayed focused on his hands rather than his face. It was a masterstroke in some ways. He maintained his mystique, avoided direct incrimination, and reminded everyone watching that he wasn't a street thug. He was a businessman. But there was a cost. The hearings painted him as one of the most powerful mob figures in America, and the public exposure made it harder for his political friends to keep protecting him. Genovese saw his opening. While Frank was fending off subpoenas and journalists, Vito was locking down alliances. He courted the remnants of the Luciano faction still loyal to him, promising a return to the old ways, where disputes were settled quickly and power was enforced with a gun, not a handshake. He also made inroads with other commission members who'd grown tired of Frank's slow, cautious style. One of the pivotal shifts came when Genovese began working closely with Carlo Gambino. Gambino was quiet, calculating, and deadly in his patience, much like Frank had been in his rise. But unlike Frank, Gambino had no qualms about aligning with Vito if it meant future power. Frank's instincts told him that this was more than just political maneuvering. It was the slow tightening of a noose. He still had Meyer Lansky, still had some allies in the commission, but the balance was shifting. And in the mob, once momentum swung against you, it was almost impossible to reverse without blood. The cracks began to show in subtle ways. A politician Frank had bankrolled for years suddenly refused to take his calls. A judge who had once dismissed charges against his men without hesitation now claimed his hands were tied. A key lieutenant was found in his car with 2 bullets in the back of his head, officially a robbery, unofficially a message. Frank was too experienced to panic, but he also knew better than to ignore the signs. He began moving money quietly, shifting assets into legitimate businesses, tightening the circle around him. His meetings became smaller, more selective. He trusted fewer people each month. Then came the hit that didn't happen. It was early 1952 when an informant, someone Frank had on the payroll inside one of Vito's satellite crews, brought him word. Genovese was floating the idea of removing him outright, not in a commission vote, not in a backroom deal. The old-fashioned way, 1 bullet, 1 night, problem solved. Frank didn't flinch when he heard it. He'd been in the game too long to be surprised by betrayal. What bothered him wasn't the threat. It was the fact that it had reached the stage where people were willing to speak it aloud. That meant the respect that once shielded him had thinned. That meant the crown was slipping. He didn't confront Vito directly. That would have been foolish. Instead, he let word leak, subtly, that anyone who made a move against him would find themselves not just at war with Frank Costello, but with Meyer Lansky, the Jewish mob, and several key allies in Chicago. It was enough to put the brakes on, for the moment. But Genovese was nothing if not patient. He didn't need to rush. He knew time was on his side. and every month that passed saw more of Frank's influence erode. The real blow came from an unexpected angle: law enforcement. In 1954, Frank was convicted of tax evasion. The sentence wasn't long, but the symbolism was devastating. Prison, even briefly, chipped away at the aura of invincibility he'd cultivated. His enemies saw it as weakness. His allies saw it as vulnerability. Vito moved faster now. He consolidated his heroin connections, tightened his grip on the crews drifting from Frank's orbit, and began whispering to the commission that the Prime Minister's time was up. When Frank walked out of prison, the city felt different. The smiles were thinner, the conversations shorter. Even some of his oldest contacts in politics treated him like a liability. He knew then that the fight was no longer about money or rackets. It was about survival. And survival meant facing the fact that Vito Genovese wasn't going to stop until one of them was in the ground. What Frank didn't know, not yet, was how close that day was. Because somewhere in the city, in the spring of 1957, a man named Vincent the Chin Gigante was already rehearsing the route he would take, the gun he would use, and the stairwell where Frank Costello's blood would spill. By the spring of 1957, Frank Costello's empire still looked solid from the outside. The slot machines were still humming in bars and back rooms, the racing wires still ran hot, and envelopes still landed on his desk each week. But Frank knew better. He could feel the rot inside the walls, smell the damp of decay under the paint. Men who'd once jumped to light his cigarette now hesitated before returning his calls. His enemies weren't just circling anymore, they were creeping in. Vito Genovese was no longer subtle about his intentions. In private conversations, in backroom whispers, he referred to himself as the rightful head of the Luciano family, painting Frank as a placeholder who'd overstayed his welcome. The word placeholder burned. Costello had run the family for years without Luciano's hand on the tiller, kept the commission stable, kept the peace. But in the mob, peace was often mistaken for weakness. Vito had allies now: Carlo Gambino, certain captains in the Bronx, some up-and-comers who saw heroin as the future, and Frank's slot machines as yesterday's news. What made it worse was the steady erosion of Frank's political connections. Judges who once took his calls were avoiding him. State officials who once owed him favors now acted like they didn't know him at all. The Kefauver hearings and his tax conviction had stripped away the veneer he'd spent decades building. Frank's closest allies, Meyer Lansky, Willie Moretti, a handful of loyal captains, warned him that Genovese was playing for keeps. But Frank still believed that as long as the commission valued stability, they wouldn't approve a move against him. He underestimated Vito's patience and his willingness to act without permission. The man Genovese chose to deliver the message was Vincent the Chin Gigante, a young enforcer in his mid-20s with a boxer's frame and a face that looked like it had already gone a few rounds with life. Gigante wasn't known for finesse. He was known for doing what he was told, no questions asked. If Genovese told him to pull the trigger, he'd pull it. The plan was simple. Follow Frank. Wait for the right moment. Do it fast. Do it clean. Send the message. The Prime Minister's reign was over. Frank's habits made him an easy mark. He liked routine, and routine is a killer in the underworld. He lived in a luxury apartment building on Central Park West, one of the last outward signs of wealth he still allowed himself. He liked to walk home when the weather was good. He never had more than one man with him, sometimes none. On the night of May 2nd, 1957, Frank attended a dinner with friends and business contacts. It wasn't a mob meeting. He avoided those in public, but it was the kind of gathering where people still deferred to him, still sought his approval. He stayed later than usual, sipping coffee and talking politics. Around 11 p.m., he finally called it a night and headed back to his apartment. Vincent Gigante was waiting. The street was quiet, the way Manhattan gets quiet late at night, traffic reduced to an occasional taxi, the sound of a distant horn echoing between buildings. Frank's driver pulled up in front of his building, a stately pre-war high-rise with a doorman who knew better than to ask questions. Frank stepped out of the car, adjusting his fedora. He was halfway to the entrance when Gigante emerged from the shadows of the sidewalk. The young gunman moved quickly, closing the gap before Frank could react. There was no preamble, no threat, no demand. Just the sudden appearance of a .38 revolver in Gigante's hand. The first thing Frank registered wasn't fear, it was anger. This was Central Park West, his street, his home. And here was some punk bringing the street war to his front door. "Hey, Frank," Gigante said, his voice low, almost conversational. Frank turned toward the voice. The gun went off. The bullet entered just above his right ear, grazing his skull. Frank's head snapped back, and for a moment he thought he was going down, but the shot wasn't clean. It hadn't penetrated his brain. Blood was running down the side of his face, warm and wet, but he was still standing. Gigante froze for a second, maybe surprised that Frank hadn't dropped. That hesitation was all Frank needed. He staggered toward the building, ignoring the shouting from the doorman and the driver. His legs felt heavy, his vision blurred, but instinct told him to keep moving, keep living. Gigante, realizing the job wasn't finished, slipped back into the darkness. Whether it was fear of witnesses, the sudden arrival of traffic, or the knowledge that a botched hit was better than getting caught, he didn't fire again. Frank made it into the lobby, leaving a trail of blood on the marble floor. The doorman called for help, and within minutes, police and an ambulance were on the scene. At the hospital, doctors removed the bullet fragment and cleaned the wound. Frank was lucky. A fraction of an inch deeper and he'd have been a corpse. As it was, the injury left him with headaches, dizziness, and a scar he'd carry for the rest of his life. The police questioned him, of course, but Frank gave them nothing. "I didn't see who it was," he told them, even though he knew exactly who had sent Gigante. That was the code. You settle these things in your own world, not theirs. Word of the attempt spread fast. In the underworld, the fact that Frank had survived was almost as significant as the attempt itself. Some saw it as a sign that he was untouchable, blessed with the kind of luck that made legends. Others saw it as proof that he was finished, a man who couldn't even walk into his own building without taking a bullet. For Frank, it was both a warning and a turning point. He understood now without doubt that Genovese wouldn't stop. The commission could look the other way. His allies could caution patience. But the reality was simple. The next time, the gunman might not miss. In the days that followed, he met with Lansky, with a few trusted captains, with the remnants of Luciano's loyalists. They all said the same thing: fight back, strike first, remove Vito before he removes you. But Frank hesitated. Whether it was age, exhaustion, or the politician's instinct to avoid direct confrontation, he couldn't bring himself to start a full-scale war. A war would draw heat, and heat was something neither the mob nor Frank's fragile political connections could survive. Instead, he made a decision that would shock his allies and embolden his enemies. He began stepping back. Quietly, without fanfare, he started letting Genovese take more control of the family's operations. It wasn't surrender, not entirely, but it was a signal that the Prime Minister's days as the undisputed head were ending. The Chin's bullet hadn't killed him, but it had wounded something deeper than flesh. It had wounded his will to hold the throne at any cost. Genovese read the moment perfectly. Within months, he was effectively running the family. By the end of the year, Frank's role was mostly symbolic, a figurehead for a family that was now Vito's in all but name. The attempt on his life had done what years of political erosion and quiet betrayal could not. It had made Frank Costello consider the possibility of walking away. But walking away from the mob was never that simple. The Chin's bullet had missed Frank Costello's brain by less than an inch, but it had hit something far more vital to a mob boss: his aura. In the days after the shooting, the newspapers ran screaming headlines: Prime Minister of the Underworld survives assassination attempt, gangland war brewing, Costello keeps silent on attacker. It didn't matter that Frank walked out of the hospital with his head wrapped and his chin up. In the underworld, survival wasn't the same as victory. Men were whispering in the clubs, in the corner booths, in the back rooms. If they can take a shot at Frank, they can take a shot at anyone. Vito Genovese didn't need to issue a public statement. His message had been delivered in gunpowder. He'd shown the commission, the street, and Costello's own men that the Prime Minister could be reached. Frank's allies tried to rally around him. Meyer Lansky came to his apartment 2 nights after he was discharged from the hospital. The blinds were drawn, the air heavy with cigarette smoke. Lansky didn't waste time with small talk. "You know it was Vito," he said flatly. Frank poured them each a drink. "Yeah," he said, "I know." "Then we hit back. We get to him before he gets to you again." Simple Frank shook his head. "It's not simple, Meyer. We start that. It's a war. A war means heat. We can't afford the heat. Not me, not you, not the commission." Meyer leaned forward. "You don't hit back, you're finished. They'll eat you alive." Frank looked down at his glass. "Maybe I'm tired of being on the menu." That was the difference between Frank Costello in 1957 and the man he'd been in the 30s. Back then, he'd have struck back with precision, removed Vito without breaking stride. But 20 years of playing politics, keeping the peace, and avoiding unnecessary blood had reshaped him. He'd survived the streets by avoiding wars. Now, that same instinct was telling him that this was one battle he might not win. Within weeks of the shooting, the commission met. Officially, it was a routine gathering to discuss territories, policy, and the usual business. Unofficially, everyone knew the real topic: who would lead the Luciano family. Genovese played it like a pro. He framed the shooting as a misunderstanding, never admitting involvement, but subtly painting Frank as too compromised to keep the seat. The tax conviction, the Senate hearings, the public scrutiny. Vito argued that these things were bad for business, that the family needed someone stronger to keep law enforcement off their backs. Frank didn't fight him. That was what shocked the room most. He didn't deliver a fiery defense, didn't threaten or posture. Instead, he said, in that calm, deliberate tone he'd perfected over the years, "If the commission thinks it's better for business, I'll step aside. I'll retire. I've made my money. Let the young men have their turn." A few members were stunned into silence. Others, including Gambino, exchanged subtle glances. This was exactly the outcome they'd been hoping for. And just like that, without a single official vote, the Luciano family quietly became the Genovese family. For Frank, the shift was both a relief and a humiliation. He'd given up the crown without a fight, but he was alive. In the mob, survival was its own kind of victory. The question now was whether he could stay alive without the protection that came with the title. The weeks after his retirement were strange. He kept a small circle of loyal men, enough to run his legitimate businesses and keep his personal affairs in order. He still had the slot machine routes, still had pieces of the wire service, still had real estate holdings that brought in steady cash. But the aura of being the boss was gone, and with it, the automatic deference that had once followed him everywhere. Law enforcement didn't ease up either. The FBI and the NYPD saw his step down as a sign of weakness and came at him harder, hoping to catch him slipping. Surveillance teams followed him to restaurants, wiretaps buzzed in his phone lines, and agents parked outside his apartment in plain sight. Frank responded the way he always had, with courtesy and composure. He'd nod to the agents tailing him, sometimes even wave. When questioned, he smiled politely and said nothing. But the constant pressure was wearing him down. One evening, over dinner at his country home in Sands Point, Long Island, Frank confided in his wife, Loretta. She'd been with him through every rise and fall, every headline and whisper. "I'm not going to be like those guys who hang around until somebody puts him in the ground," he said, pushing his plate aside. "I've been lucky. Luck doesn't last forever." Loretta lit a cigarette, exhaling slowly. "So what are you saying?" "I'm saying I'm going to pull back. Really pull back. Let Vito have his fun. I'll keep the legit stuff. Maybe disappear from the city for a while." Loretta studied him for a long moment. "And if he comes after you anyway?" Frank smiled faintly. "Then I guess we'll see how much luck I've got left." Pulling back was easier said than done. Even in retirement, Frank was still a man of influence. Politicians he'd helped over the years still owed him favors. Businessmen still sought his advice. And in the mob world, old loyalties die hard. Some captains continued to send him envelopes, either out of habit or quiet defiance of Genovese. That, inevitably, stirred Vito's suspicion. To a man like Genovese, there was no such thing as a harmless rival. Even out of power, Frank was a potential threat. In late 1958, a rumor reached Frank through a trusted source. Vito was considering finishing the job. No warnings this time, no showy street corner shooting, something quieter, poison maybe, or a staged accident. Frank didn't panic. He simply tightened his routine, kept his movements unpredictable, and reduced the number of people who knew where he'd be on any given day. It was the same kind of careful maneuvering that had kept him alive for so long, but now it was purely defensive. The balance between them never tipped into open warfare again. Maybe Vito decided it wasn't worth the trouble to kill a man who was no longer competing for power. Maybe he respected Frank's decision to walk away. Or maybe he just didn't want to invite Lansky and other allies into a retaliatory blood feud. Whatever the reason, the years rolled on, and Frank Costello remained alive, scarred, diminished, but alive. He spent more time at Sands Point, tending to his garden, entertaining small gatherings of old friends. The man who had once been able to sway senators and judges with a word now contented himself with the slow pleasures of semi-retirement. But there was always a shadow, always the knowledge that the life he'd led didn't let men simply fade away. And in the quiet of those evenings, Frank sometimes wondered if he'd made the right choice. Walking away had saved his life, but it had cost him everything else. The year after Frank Costello retired was one of strange contradictions. To the outside world, it looked like the Prime Minister had finally stepped off the stage, leaving the lights and heat to younger, hungrier men. But behind the curtains, Frank still had a hand in the game, just not the same way he used to. The truth was, men like Frank didn't ever really retire. They didn't punch out and take up fishing. They stayed in orbit, even if only as a voice on the phone, a shadow in the back booth, a nod from across the restaurant. The underworld was made of connections, and Frank's web was still intact. He had favors owed to him that stretched back decades, politicians, businessmen, judges, and gangsters who had all, at one time or another, relied on him to smooth a path or bury a problem. Vito Genovese might have taken the family name, but he didn't have Frank's reach outside the mob. In politics, in certain corners of legitimate business, Frank's name still meant something. It meant the guy who could get you what you needed without turning it into a circus. It meant reliability, something rare in any business, but especially in one built on treachery. Genovese understood this, and it gnawed at him. It wasn't enough to have the official title. He wanted Costello's ghost gone from the halls of power entirely. But here was the problem. Eliminating Frank outright would raise questions. It would look like a vendetta. Worse, it could invite retaliation from Lansky and the other out-of-town players who still respected Frank. So instead, Vito went with a slow squeeze. He leaned on the captains, who still sent envelopes to Frank, suggesting that their loyalty was misplaced. He maneuvered Frank's men out of key positions, replacing them with his own people. He cut into the wire service business, funneled slot machine routes to his allies, and quietly bought influence in the very city offices Frank used to command. Frank saw it happening, but he didn't bite. The old instincts, the ones that told him to push back, were still there. But the bullet scar above his ear was a constant reminder of what pushing back could cost. He wasn't going to walk back into the line of fire. Instead, he adapted. He leaned heavier into his legitimate holdings. The real estate investments he'd made over the years began paying dividends, and certain front businesses had grown into genuinely profitable ventures. He began spending more time at his Sands Point estate on Long Island, a sprawling property with manicured gardens, high hedges, and a main house that could host 50 guests without feeling crowded. The estate became his fortress, both physically and mentally. From there, he could hold court in a quieter way. Men still came to see him, old associates seeking advice, small-time operators looking for introductions, politicians who wanted to reconnect with a man who still knew how to make things happen discreetly. Frank rarely refused them an audience. He'd meet them in his study, a large room lined with dark wood shelves and heavy drapes. The air always smelled faintly of cigars and polished leather. Loretta would bring coffee or drinks depending on the hour, and then leave them to talk. Frank's counsel was different now. He no longer told men how to take over a racket. Instead, he told them how to stay alive. Don't make enemies you don't have to make, he'd say. Money's not worth a bullet in the head. If you can talk your way into something, it'll last longer than if you take it with a gun. Some listened, some didn't. The young ones, especially, thought they'd be the next Luciano, the next Costello. He'd smile at them, knowing the odds. The streets didn't make many old men. But even in retirement, danger had a way of finding him. In 1959, a federal investigation into illegal gambling briefly put him back in the headlines. His name appeared in connection with several seized slot machines, though nothing stuck. Frank handled it the way he always had, calmly, politely, denying any involvement without ever showing his hand. Privately, though, he felt the pressure. Every time his name appeared in print, it risked stirring up trouble with Genovese, who might see it as a sign that Frank was still active. And every time law enforcement came sniffing around, it threatened the quiet life he was trying to build. The uneasy peace between Frank and Vito held for a few reasons. First, Frank made it clear he wasn't going to challenge for power again. Second, Vito was increasingly distracted by his own problems, namely, a federal indictment for narcotics trafficking. In 1959, Genovese was convicted and sentenced to 15 years in prison. Frank didn't gloat, but he recognized the irony. The man who had taken his crown was now caged, brought down by the very trade Frank had always avoided. Still, he didn't make the mistake of thinking it meant he was safe. Genovese's reach extended beyond prison walls, and the men who had replaced Frank's people were still loyal to Vito. With Genovese in prison, Carlo Gambino's influence grew, and the shape of the mob shifted again. Gambino was quieter, more calculating than Vito, and in some ways, closer in style to Frank. The two men found an odd sort of detente. Gambino didn't try to squeeze Frank the way Vito had, and in return, Frank stayed out of Gambino's business. In his later years, Frank became something of a symbol, proof that a man could survive the life without ending up in prison for decades or buried in an unmarked grave. But he also became a cautionary tale. To the ambitious, his retreat looked like weakness. To the cautious, it looked like wisdom. He spent more and more time tending to his gardens, hosting dinners for small groups, and traveling quietly with Loretta. The man who had once walked into rooms where judges and mobsters mingled now preferred the company of a few trusted friends over expensive meals and fine wine. Still, there were moments when the old fire flickered. A phone call from an old associate, a piece of news about some young upstart trying to muscle into an old racket. These things could still bring that sharp, calculating look back to his eyes. But it never lasted. He'd shake his head, pour another drink, and let the thought pass. By the early 1970s, Frank Costello was an elder statesman of organized crime in the truest sense, not in power, but in memory. Younger men spoke his name with a mix of respect and disbelief. Respect for the way he'd run things, disbelief that anyone could have stepped away and lived to talk about it. For Frank, the irony was not lost. He'd built an empire on influence, survived betrayals and bullets, and in the end, the thing that kept him alive was the thing most mob bosses could never bring themselves to do: let go. But he also knew one truth about the life that never changed. You don't retire from the mob. Not really. You just keep breathing until someone decides you shouldn't. By the early 1970s, Frank Costello had been out of the top spot for over a decade and a half. He was no longer the man who could pick up a phone and make a mayor sweat, no longer the center of whispered deals in smoky rooms. But he was alive, and in the life he had lived, that fact alone was something close to a miracle. In public, Costello looked every bit the aging gentleman. His hair, silver now, was always combed back neatly. His suits were still tailored, his shoes shined, his shirts crisp. He had the quiet dignity of a man who knew how to present himself, even if the power that once came with that image had long since been stripped away. But inside, the instincts never died. He still noticed who was watching him when he walked into a restaurant. He still kept his back to the wall. He still took different routes home, never arriving anywhere exactly when expected. The habits that had kept him alive for decades were too deeply ingrained to let go of, even in so-called retirement. The estate in Sands Point became more than just a home. It became a fortress, The tall hedges kept prying eyes away, and the long driveway meant no one could approach without being seen. The grounds were immaculate, a reflection of Frank's own discipline. He often walked the property in the mornings, cigarette in hand, inspecting the roses, checking the hedges, noting which trees needed trimming. Loretta remained his constant companion, the one person who had been there through every turn of his life. Their relationship had its silences, years of secrets, long nights apart, phone calls taken in other rooms, but there was also a bond built on shared history. She had lived through the same storms he had, and she understood the man better than anyone else. Every so often, the phone would ring with a voice from the past. Sometimes it was an old political contact, now retired, reminiscing about the old days. Sometimes it was a younger mobster asking for advice on a deal or a problem. Frank rarely refused to talk, but his counsel had shifted with time. "Don't get greedy," he'd tell them. "Greedy men make mistakes. Mistakes get you in the papers or in the ground." In 1972, Frank made one of his rare public appearances at the funeral of Anthony Tony Bender Strollo, a Genovese family capo who had mysteriously disappeared years earlier and whose body was never found. It was a calculated appearance, a quiet signal to the underworld that he was still breathing, still connected, still someone whose presence mattered. But it was also a reminder that most of the men he had come up with were gone now, victims of bullets, prison, or betrayal. That same year, the FBI tried once again to tie him to illegal gambling operations. Surveillance teams photographed him meeting with known figures, but nothing concrete came of it. Frank had perfected the art of plausible deniability. If he met someone for lunch, it could always be explained as a social visit. If money changed hands, it was part of a legitimate business. Still, the attention wore on him. In quiet moments, he admitted to Loretta that the constant pressure, even after stepping down, was exhausting. "They'll never stop looking," he said once over breakfast. "They want the headline. Old mob boss finally falls. I'm not gonna give it to them." Frank's relationship with the new generation of mob leadership was complicated. Carlo Gambino, who had risen to the top after Genovese's fall, treated him with a kind of respectful neutrality. Gambino didn't see Frank as a threat, but he also didn't entirely trust him. Younger bosses like Paul Castellano regarded him as a relic, valuable for his history maybe, but irrelevant to the modern game. Frank didn't mind. In fact, he preferred it. Being underestimated was safer than being feared. Fear got you killed. Irrelevance kept you alive. By the mid-1970s, Frank's days fell into a rhythm. Mornings were for walks around the estate, reading the paper, making a few discreet phone calls. Afternoons might be spent in the city, visiting old friends or handling business with his legitimate companies. Evenings were quiet, dinner with Loretta, a drink in his study, the news on television. But the past had a way of seeping in, even when you tried to wall it off. Some nights he would sit alone in the study, drink in hand, staring at the photographs on the walls. Pictures from the old days, him and Luciano in better times, Meyer Lansky at some forgotten gathering, politicians whose names were now just footnotes. He'd think about the decisions he'd made, the men he'd trusted, the enemies he'd allowed to live. The Chin's bullet in '57 had been the turning point. He knew it. If that night had gone differently, if the bullet had struck just a fraction deeper, his story would have ended there. Instead, he had been given the rarest of gifts in the mob world, time. And with time came the curse of watching everyone else fall. The 1970s were not kind to the underworld. The government had new tools, wiretaps, RICO laws, informants protected by witness relocation. The code of silence, the old omerta, was cracking. Men were flipping for lighter sentences, giving up bosses and friends alike. Frank shook his head at it all. "Whole thing's rotten now," he told one visitor. "Used to be you took the time, you kept your mouth shut. Now they hand you a subpoena and half the room disappears." By 1979, Frank was nearing 90, though he still carried himself with a certain authority. His health was holding, though slower steps and more frequent rests were part of the routine now. He still read the papers every morning, still kept an eye on the shifting currents of the underworld. And though he never said it aloud, he knew the end wasn't far off, not from violence, but from age. In his final years, he became more reflective. He spoke less about deals and rackets and more about survival, about the difference between living well and simply not dying. Most of the guys I came up with, he said once, they thought the game was about winning. It's not. It's about staying in it long enough to walk away. Frank Costello had done that. He had walked away, not entirely clean, but alive, and on his own terms. In a life where almost nobody got to write their own ending, that was the closest thing to a victory there was. By the dawn of the 1980s, Frank Costello was a living relic. The men he had come up with, Luciano, Lansky, Gambino, were either dead, imprisoned, or shadows of their former selves. The streets had changed. The rackets had changed. Even the faces of organized crime had changed. The new generation wasn't cut from the same cloth. They weren't as polished, as patient, or as careful. They wore flashier suits, drove louder cars, and craved headlines. Many of them didn't know the old rules, and if they did, they didn't respect them. To Frank, it was a sign of decline, a rot that had set in after the old guard was gone. Young guys now, he told a friend one evening in his study, they don't think past next week. They'll take a score today that brings heat for 10 years. Then they wonder why they're standing in front of a judge. He wasn't wrong. The FBI and federal prosecutors were tearing into the mob like never before. RICO laws meant that bosses could be taken down for crimes committed by their soldiers, and wiretaps were everywhere. Meetings that would have once been whispered about over dinner were now being played back in courtrooms for juries. Frank's world had been built on discretion. Even when you killed a man, you did it in a way that didn't cause a public scene. The new crop didn't seem to understand that. They were shooting each other in broad daylight, letting their names land in the tabloids, drawing attention that was toxic to the life. Still, Frank wasn't bitter, not exactly. He had always known that the life had cycles. Every generation thought it was the smartest, and every generation thought the one before it was outdated. The only difference was that his generation had survived long enough to see the end coming. Most never did. By now, Frank's role was mostly social. He was still invited to certain dinners, still sought out for his opinion on political matters by old contacts, but he had no active stake in the mob's business. He was content to keep it that way. Loretta, too, was slowing down. The two of them spent more time at Sands Point than anywhere else, hosting fewer guests, but keeping a tight circle of loyal friends. The property was as carefully maintained as ever, but Frank wasn't walking it as much. He'd take a chair out to the terrace instead, sip his coffee, and look out over the gardens. In 1981, Frank suffered a mild stroke. It didn't take his speech or his mind, but it slowed him. He moved more carefully, spoke more slowly, and began to accept that his body was no longer under his complete command. The newspapers got wind of it. Former mob boss in failing health, but Frank waved it off. "I'm still here," he told a reporter who caught him outside a Manhattan restaurant. "That's more than I can say for a lot of people." The stroke seemed to deepen his reflective side. Friends noticed he talked more about the past now, about the choices he'd made and the roads he hadn't taken. One evening, with the sun setting over the Long Island Sound, he told an old associate, "I could have gone after Vito that night. You know I could have, but I didn't. And because I didn't, I'm here, sitting in this chair, talking to you." That's the thing about power. Sometimes the best move is walking away before it kills you. By 1982, Frank rarely went into the city anymore. The energy of Manhattan was different, faster, more chaotic. The old clubs were gone or changed beyond recognition. Many of the restaurants he'd once favored had closed, their owners retired or dead. The few times he did venture in, it was usually for something important, an old friend's funeral, a discreet lunch with a trusted politician, or an appearance at a private social club. Even then, he kept the visits short and his movements unannounced. In 1983, the New York Times published a long piece on the history of the mob in America. Frank's name came up repeatedly, painted as the diplomatic Don, a man who had avoided unnecessary violence and preferred influence to intimidation. The article was almost flattering, and while Frank dismissed it publicly, privately he admitted to Loretta that he didn't mind how it made him look. "That's the version of me I want people to remember," he said. Not the kid from East Harlem running numbers, not the guy with the slot machines, the man who kept the peace. But in the same breath, he acknowledged the price. Peace had cost him the top seat. It had cost him men who saw compromise as weakness. It had nearly cost him his life. By the summer of 1984, Frank's health was visibly in decline. The strong frame that had carried him through decades of pressure was thinner now, his movements slower. But his mind was still sharp, and he remained engaged with the world. He followed politics closely, read the newspapers daily, and occasionally offered quiet advice to those who sought him out. That autumn, he made what would be his last public speech, if it could be called that, at a private charity dinner. Invited by an old political ally, Frank stood briefly to thank the crowd for their generosity and to joke that he was just an old man enjoying good company. It was understated, but those who knew him understood the subtext. Frank Costello had lived a life that should have ended in a hail of bullets or in a prison cell. Instead, he had stepped away, navigated decades of shifting alliances, and reached his 80s with his freedom and dignity intact. In early 1985, Frank suffered another stroke, this one more serious. He was hospitalized for several days before being released to recover at Sands Point. Friends visited, but many left shaken. The once commanding presence was diminished, his speech slower, his eyes sometimes distant. He died quietly on February 18, 1985, at the age of 82. There was no violence, no scandal, no courtroom drama. Just the final chapter of a man who had outlived most of his enemies and many of his friends. His funeral was a mix of worlds as his life had been. A few remaining mob figures, old political contacts, family, and those who had known him only as a charming, impeccably dressed gentleman. There were no public displays of power, no grand speeches, just a quiet service for a man who had once been one of the most powerful figures in America's underworld. In the days after his death, the papers wrote their obituaries. Some painted him as a criminal mastermind, others as a statesman of the mob who preferred deals to bloodshed. The truth, as always, was somewhere in between. Frank Costello had been many things: bootlegger, gambler, political fixer, boss, survivor. But above all, he had been a pragmatist. He understood the limits of power and the price of holding on to it too long. And because of that, he had managed what few in his world ever could: to walk away alive. Frank Costello's death in February 1985 didn't send shockwaves through the underworld the way other mob deaths did. There were no retaliatory hits, no sudden changes in the power structure. The streets didn't go quiet in fear. Instead, there was something quieter, almost solemn, a recognition that an era had truly ended. For the old-timers who had survived into the 1980s, Costello was one of the last direct links to the commission era of Lucky Luciano. He had been there when the mob was reorganized into something resembling a corporation, when street gangs and bootlegging crews became formal families with rules, territories, and councils. And he had been the only man to hold the top seat of a family and voluntarily step down without ending up in a coffin or a prison cell. Within days of his death, mob hangouts across New York were quietly sharing the same line. The Prime Minister made it all the way. In their world, all the way meant dying of natural causes with money in the bank, a loyal wife by your side, and your name still carrying weight. But Costello's legacy was not universally admired. To some, he was the model of how to run the life: low profile, heavy on influence, light on bloodshed. To others, he was a symbol of what they considered the mob's softening, a boss more comfortable shaking hands with senators than giving orders in the back room of a social club. In the years immediately following his death, law enforcement and journalists painted him as the gentleman gangster, a title that had both truth and myth in it. Yes, he dressed impeccably, spoke politely, and avoided unnecessary killings, but Frank Costello was no saint. His rise had been built on the same foundation as every other mob boss: bribery, extortion, illegal gambling, and the occasional violent removal of obstacles. The difference was that he understood the value of how it was done. Costello had spent his career proving that a mob boss didn't have to be the loudest or most feared man in the room to control it. He could be the calm one, the man people came to for solutions, the one who brokered peace instead of declaring war. It was a strategy that kept him in power for decades, and more importantly, kept him alive when other bosses were meeting violent ends. Law enforcement veterans who had chased him during his prime gave grudging respect after his death. One retired NYPD detective, interviewed for a magazine piece, said, "He wasn't flashy and he wasn't sloppy. You couldn't pin anything on him because he didn't handle it directly. Always had layers between him and the dirt. The guy was a chess player, not a brawler. That's why he lasted." Meanwhile, among the younger generation of mobsters in the mid-1980s, his name carried a different kind of weight. They spoke of him like a mythic figure, a man who had stood in the center of the storm and walked out untouched. Some saw that as an example to follow. Others saw it as outdated in a world that now thrived on faster money and bigger risks. In the political world, Costello's passing was met with silence. The politicians who had once benefited from his support were either dead, retired, or pretending they'd never known him. But in private conversations, some admitted that Costello had been an irreplaceable fixer, someone who could make city machinery work quietly in ways the official channels never could. His estate in Sands Point remained in Loretta's hands until her death years later. Visitors to the property in the months after Frank's passing described it as almost untouched, as if he might walk in at any moment, his tailored suit still hanging in the closet, his study still lined with neatly organized files and old photographs, his favorite chair still by the window. Even in death, Costello's reputation as a survivor became his most enduring trait. It was repeated in documentaries, books, and interviews. He beat the life. He retired. He died at home. In the culture of organized crime, where funerals were often closed-casket affairs due to the condition of the body, that made him an almost mythical exception. But survival alone wasn't his whole legacy. The Costello way of running a family, through political influence, legitimate business fronts, and minimizing public violence, left a mark on how certain mob bosses operated in the decades that followed. Paul Castellano, for instance, adopted a similar boss-as-businessman image, though his reign ended violently. Others, like Joseph Bonanno in his later years, took Costello's example as proof that stepping back could be an acceptable endgame. Yet there was a hard truth that Frank's life also proved. His style only worked in an era when politics and organized crime were deeply intertwined. By the time of his death, the landscape had changed. Politicians were more cautious, prosecutors more aggressive, and the media less willing to look the other way. The handshakes and quiet deals that had been Costello's stock in trade were harder to make in the harsh light of constant public scrutiny. This made his legend even sharper in hindsight. He was a man perfectly suited to his time, who might not have survived in the mob if he'd come up 20 years later. The FBI kept files on him right until the end, though after the 1960s they were more like archives than active investigations. His name would appear occasionally in reports, someone mentioning him in a wiretap conversation, or an informant claiming to have seen him dining with a political figure. But there was never any evidence he'd returned to active involvement in the mob's affairs after stepping down in 1957. When the New York tabloids ran retrospectives in the weeks after his death, they invariably returned to the same two images. The courtroom, still from the Kefauver hearings, showing only his hands on the table, and the grainy black and white of him being helped into the hospital after Vincent the Chin Gigante's botched hit. Those two pictures told the story, one of a man who avoided the spotlight and one of a man who survived when survival seemed impossible. In the neighborhoods of East Harlem where he'd grown up, the old-timers still remembered Frankie as a kid running errands for gamblers, a teenager who learned quickly that brains beat fists. Some spoke of how he'd helped families with rent, how he'd paid for funerals, how he'd gotten people jobs through his political contacts. Others remembered the fear, what happened to people who crossed him, the quiet disappearances. In truth, both were part of the same man. Frank Costello's genius was in making sure people remembered whichever version served him best. Years later, mob historians would debate his place in the pantheon of American organized crime. Was he the most effective boss of his era, or simply the luckiest? Did his decision to step down in 1957 mark him as a coward avoiding war, or a visionary who knew when to walk away? What no one could dispute was that his life story was singular. He had come from nothing, an immigrant kid in a crowded tenement, and risen to control one of the most powerful criminal organizations in the country. He had rubbed shoulders with senators, dictated terms to rival bosses, and outmaneuvered the law for decades. And when the inevitable challenge came, he chose survival over pride. For the mob, that choice was controversial. For everyone else, it was almost incomprehensible. But for Frank Costello, it was the move that let him play the longest game of all. Frank Costello's body had been in the ground only a few weeks when his name began surfacing again, not in the police blotter or wiretap transcripts, but in conversations among the old guard and the new blood of the mob. The man had been gone since February 1985, yet for those still in the life, he was still a point of reference. To the veterans who'd survived long enough to remember his reign, Costello's name was shorthand for diplomacy. "Do it the Costello way," some older capos would say when a young soldier suggested a violent takeover. It meant handle it without headlines, without blood in the street, with a handshake that bought you time instead of an FBI squad car. To the younger generation, though, Costello was a strange figure, almost a contradiction. Here was a man who had been boss of one of the most powerful families in the country, had been the target of an assassination attempt, and yet had stepped down without starting a war. For men raised on the bloody reputations of Paul Castellano, John Gotti, or Carmine Galante, the idea of retiring seemed alien, even weak. That divide in perception was telling. Costello's style belonged to an era when mob bosses thought in decades, not weeks. By the mid to late 1980s, the life was changing fast. The FBI was more aggressive than ever, RICO was in full swing, and the witness protection program was draining the strength out of families by turning soldiers into informants. In this environment, the old prime minister approach, quiet influence, political leverage, and legitimate business fronts, was harder to pull off. Still, his influence lingered in certain corners. Some bosses, especially those who had lived through the Luciano era, tried to emulate his low-profile style. The Philadelphia mob's Angelo Bruno, before his own murder in 1980, had ruled in a way that drew comparisons to Costello, favoring stability over bloodshed, building political ties, and avoiding unnecessary violence. Bruno's death was proof that not everyone appreciated that style. He was taken out by his own men. Even after his death, Frank Costello's example was used as both inspiration and warning. On one hand, he was proof that a boss could survive the life and die at home in his bed. On the other, he was a reminder that such a path often meant surrendering power before someone took it from you. In the years following his passing, organized crime faced a wave of high-profile takedowns. The so-called commission case in 1986, where federal prosecutors used RICO to convict the heads of New York's 5 families, would have been unthinkable in Costello's prime. For the first time, the very structure Luciano had helped build, and which Costello had once led, was laid bare in a courtroom for the world to see. It was hard not to imagine how Costello might have reacted. He had always prized the separation between the mob's inner workings and the public eye. The idea of bosses being identified by name, sitting in the dock together while prosecutors displayed charts of the mafia structure, would have been unthinkable to him. In fact, some older mobsters blamed the downfall of the commission on the loss of leaders like Costello, who understood the value of keeping the organization invisible. The flashy styles of later bosses, cars, nightclubs, public swagger, were magnets for law enforcement. Costello would have called it amateur hour. Beyond the mob itself, Costello's name began to enter popular culture in new ways. He became the archetype of the gentleman gangster in books, documentaries, and eventually films. Screenwriters borrowed pieces of his life, his calm demeanor, his political connections, his refusal to be drawn into unnecessary wars, and wove them into fictional characters. In Martin Scorsese's The Departed, Jack Nicholson's character even borrowed his surname, though the portrayal was far more unhinged than the real Costello had ever been. For historians and organized crime writers, Costello was a gold mine. His story allowed them to explore the transformation of the American mob from the violent chaos of the early 20th century to the disciplined, structured empire of the mid-century, and to show how fragile that structure became in the face of changing times. Law enforcement veterans also kept his name alive in training rooms and lectures. For FBI agents studying organized crime, Costello was a case study in how influence could be more dangerous than violence. He was living proof that the mob's most powerful weapon wasn't always the gun, it was the network. And that was perhaps his most lasting legacy, the idea that control didn't have to come from fear alone. Costello had built his power by being indispensable to everyone around him, politicians, businessmen, rival bosses. He had made himself the man people went to when they needed something done quietly. In the late 1980s, as RICO convictions dismantled much of the old hierarchy, a few surviving bosses tried to revive that style. Vincent Chin Gigante, ironically, the same man who had once tried to kill Costello, adopted a low-profile approach, staying out of public view and feigning mental illness to avoid prosecution. Gigante's method was different in execution, but the principle, stay in the shadows, avoid the spotlight, was pure Costello. Meanwhile, the broader public memory of Frank Costello became more romanticized. Journalists wrote nostalgic pieces about the old mob, when bosses were supposedly more disciplined and the violence was kept in the family. These pieces often glossed over the fact that Costello's world had been as ruthless as any other, just with better manners. By the 1990s, Costello's name had taken on a certain mystique. For younger mob associates who'd grown up hearing stories about him, he was almost a mythical figure. They'd repeat lines like, "Frank Costello made it all the way," or "he was the last of the real bosses." These were half-truths wrapped in legend, but in the mob, legend often mattered as much as fact. Academics studying organized crime also took an interest. Criminologists pointed to Costello as a rare example of a mob leader who operated like a corporate CEO, using strategy and diplomacy rather than brute force. Some even argued that his approach delayed the government's ability to effectively prosecute organized crime, since men like Costello left fewer obvious trails than their more violent peers. Of course, not everyone in the life admired him. Hardliners saw his 1957 decision to step down as a betrayal of the code, proof that when pushed, he'd rather save himself than go down swinging. But even those critics had to admit that the choice had bought him something most mob bosses never had, another 28 years of life. By the turn of the millennium, as the five families struggled to maintain relevance in a world of wiretaps, global drug cartels, and the internet, the Costello model of leadership seemed almost quaint. The new era was faster, dirtier, more volatile. The days when a boss could operate largely in the political shadows were gone, and yet, in closed-door meetings and whispered advice sessions, his name still came up. When a young capo started making too much noise, someone might say, "You want to end up like Gotti or you want to end up like Costello?" It was a warning. Be smart, be invisible, live long enough to walk away. In the end, Frank Costello's posthumous influence wasn't about the rackets he'd run or the money he'd made. It was about the way he had done it, and the fact that he had done what almost no one else in his position ever could. He had played the long game, and he had won. If there was one part of Frank Costello's legacy that left the deepest mark on organized crime, it was his mastery of politics. He hadn't just bribed officials. Any street hood with a thick envelope could do that. Costello had cultivated politicians, nurtured them, and built mutual dependencies that outlasted elections, scandals, and even jail sentences. When he died in 1985, the five families had already begun losing their grip on the political machine. The corruption was still there. City Hall still had its hands in dirty pockets, but it lacked the polish and precision that Costello had perfected. He had been the bridge between the mob and the suits, the translator between street slang and the language of legislation. Frank's influence had been subtle but pervasive. Judges had owed him not just cash but favors. Police commissioners had quietly taken his calls. State legislators had allowed small bills to pass that benefited his businesses. The man could pick up a phone and get a zoning law adjusted, a liquor license approved, or a raid postponed. And he never did it with a threat. He did it with charm, timing, and an understanding of what the other man wanted. That was what separated him from the muscle-bound bosses who came after. They saw politicians as tools to be used and discarded. Frank saw them as investments. After his retirement in 1957, many of those connections still ran through him. He may not have been on the street, but his Rolodex was still gold. Even Genovese, who despised him, had to admit that Frank could get things done that no one else could. By the time of his death, most of those politicians were either dead or retired, but the model remained. For years after, ambitious mob figures tried to replicate it. They sent envelopes to campaign offices, funded fundraisers, and courted young city officials the way Frank had done. But they lacked his patience. They wanted immediate payback for their investments. Costello had known that the real return sometimes took years, and that the key was making the politician believe they were in control. The 1980s and 1990s were unkind to that approach. The public corruption scandals of the late 70s and 80s, Abscon, for example, had made politicians more wary about taking mob money. The press was more aggressive, and investigative journalists were hunting for links between organized crime and city government. Wiretaps and undercover stings made every handshake a potential noose. The most glaring sign that the Costello era of political influence was over came with the 1986 commission case. Federal prosecutors didn't just target mob bosses, they also went after the corrupt unions, construction contracts, and waste management deals that had been protected for decades by politicians in their pockets. That kind of broad assault would have been harder in Frank's day, not because law enforcement didn't have the tools, but because the mob's political armor was thicker. Frank's surviving associates lamented the change. "We had the city wired once," one old-timer told a reporter years later. "Frank had judges, senators, everybody. Now you can't get a parking ticket fixed without someone recording the call." Still, traces of his political playbook lingered well into the 1990s. Certain borough politicians were still rumored to take quiet meetings with friends of the family, and construction contracts for public projects still had a way of landing in the laps of mob-connected firms. The garbage carting industry, one of Costello's old interests, remained under mob influence for years after his death, its survival in part a result of political protections built decades earlier. But by the turn of the millennium, the tide had shifted decisively. Federal oversight, aggressive prosecutors, and a new breed of politician, more media-conscious, more careerist, meant that the open handshake between mob and government was mostly gone. There were still corrupt officials, but they operated at arm's length, laundering favors through layers of intermediaries that even Frank might have found frustrating. In academic circles, Costello's political model became a subject of study. Criminologists and historians dissected how he had embedded himself into the fabric of city governance without ever holding office. They noted that his relationships weren't purely transactional. He cultivated genuine loyalty. He remembered birthdays, sent flowers to funerals, and made introductions that benefited the politician as much as himself. That kind of relationship building, they argued, was harder to prosecute because it didn't always leave an obvious quid pro quo. If a judge's nephew got a job through a friend of Costello's, was that a bribe or just networking? If a state senator voted against a bill that hurt the slot machine business, was that corruption or coincidence? Costello had thrived in those gray areas. Within the mob itself, his name became synonymous with political finesse. Older capos would still tell their soldiers, "We need a Costello guy," meaning someone with a foot in both worlds. But increasingly, those Costello guys were harder to find. Politics was more transparent than it had been in the 1930s and 40s, and even the most corrupt operators were wary of being caught on the wrong side of a federal investigation. Ironically, the very thing that had made Costello so powerful, His ability to blend legitimate and illegitimate worlds was now a liability in the modern mob. The FBI and IRS were quick to investigate any businessman with suspected mob ties, and the media loved nothing more than a corruption scandal. But in the neighborhoods where the mob still had a presence, Costello's legend lived on. In certain Italian social clubs in Little Italy and Bensonhurst, you could still hear older men talk about the Prime Minister with respect. They'd tell stories of how he could walk into City Hall without an appointment, how a word from him could stop an investigation cold, how he'd kept the peace between rival families when war seemed inevitable. The younger men listened, half in awe, half skeptical. They'd grown up in an era where political connections were more likely to be liabilities than assets. To them, Costello's way sounded like a fairy tale from another century. In truth, it was. The kind of political machine that had allowed him to operate no longer existed in the same form. The Tammany Hall-style bosses who traded favors for votes were long gone, replaced by media-driven campaigns and 24-hour news cycles. The smoke-filled rooms where deals were made in whispers had been replaced by press conferences and televised debates. And yet, even as the machinery changed, the principle remained timeless. Influence was more valuable than fear. That was the lesson Frank Costello had left behind. It was just that in the modern world, cultivating that influence was harder, riskier, and less likely to last. By the late 2000s, when documentaries about organized crime inevitably reached the Costello chapter, the tone was always tinged with nostalgia. Interviewees, retired mobsters, former prosecutors, historians would describe him as the last of the statesmen, a gentleman in a brutal business, or the bridge between two worlds. What they meant, even if they didn't say it outright, was that he had understood something most in his world never grasped, that power built on fear dies with the man who wields it, but power built on loyalty and mutual interest can survive long after he's gone. In that sense, Frank Costello's political shadow stretched far beyond his lifetime. It wasn't that the mob still ran New York politics. It didn't, at least not like before. But the methods he pioneered had been absorbed into the DNA of organized crime everywhere. Know the right people, make yourself useful, and never let them see you coming. If Frank Costello was remembered for his political finesse, his second great talent was business diversification. He had never been content to rely solely on the rackets that had built his fortune. Gambling, slots, the racing wire. Those were volatile streams. A new law, a sudden police crackdown, or an ambitious rival could wipe them out overnight. Frank understood that if you wanted to survive in the long run, you had to build something the law couldn't easily touch. From the 1920s onward, Frank had been quietly funneling mob money into legitimate enterprises. At first, it was just a cover, a bar here, a small import business there. But over time, these fronts started to produce real profits. He learned how to run them well, hiring competent managers, keeping the books clean, and making sure everything could pass a basic audit if it had to. By the time Prohibition ended in 1933, many mob bosses were scrambling to replace the income they'd lost from bootlegging. Costello wasn't scrambling. He'd already shifted his focus to slot machines, which were legal in some places and could be placed in bars, clubs, and restaurants with little fuss. The trick wasn't just owning the machines, it was controlling the routes, the network of locations that generated steady, predictable cash. Frank's slot machine empire reached from New York to New Orleans, where he had a lucrative arrangement with the local political machine. For every nickel dropped into a machine, Frank got his cut, the location owner got theirs, and the politicians got a taste for looking the other way. It was the kind of system that didn't make headlines, but built wealth day by day. But Costello didn't stop there. He invested heavily in real estate, apartment buildings, storefronts, warehouses. These weren't flashy purchases, they were practical. He targeted areas that were growing, buying cheap and holding for years. By the 1940s, some of those properties had doubled or tripled in value. Real estate had another advantage. It was a legitimate asset that law enforcement couldn't just seize without cause. Even if they suspected the purchase had been made with illicit funds, proving it was another matter. And once the properties were in the books, the rent checks were clean money. Frank also developed an eye for gray businesses, ventures that weren't strictly illegal, but thrived in the spaces between regulation and enforcement. One example was the horse racing wire service. Bookmakers needed fast, reliable results to set odds and pay out bets, and whoever controlled the wire controlled the action. Frank made sure he had a stake in it, working with figures like Moses Annenberg and later with Meyer Lansky to keep the service under friendly control. Unlike some mobsters who blew their money on gambling, women, and high living, Costello reinvested most of his profits. Even his personal spending was calculated. He dressed impeccably, yes, but his clothes were investments in his image. His Sands Point estate wasn't just a home. It was a place to entertain, to impress, to conduct business without prying eyes. This long-term view of wealth building became even more important after the 1957 assassination attempt and his retirement from active leadership. When he stepped back, he didn't step down into poverty. His legitimate holdings, real estate, clean businesses, investments in construction and distribution, generated enough income to support him comfortably for the rest of his life. It was one of the reasons he could walk away when Genovese came for him. Most bosses couldn't imagine leaving power, because without the mob's rackets, they'd have nothing. Frank had the luxury of choice because he had built his safety net decades earlier. His approach to business left a deep impression on certain mob figures who came after. Paul Castellano, for example, styled himself as a racketeer industrialist, emphasizing the importance of legitimate-looking operations alongside the traditional rackets. But while Castellano tried to mimic Costello's businessman image, he lacked Frank's political skill and fell victim to a far bloodier end. Even outside the mob, some businessmen quietly admired Costello's strategy. The idea of taking high-risk profits and channeling them into low-risk long-term investments was hardly unique to organized crime, but in Frank's hands, it was an art form. After his death in 1985, lawyers handling his estate found that much of his wealth was clean enough to pass without major government challenge. The FBI had long suspected that some of his legitimate businesses had been seeded with mob money. But by the time they were scrutinized, decades had passed and the paper trail was too faint to follow. The diversification also helped protect him from the kind of devastating RICO seizures that crippled mob finances in the 1980s and 90s. While other families watched their cash flows evaporate as the Fed seized union funds, labor rackets, and illegal gambling operations, Frank's portfolio had been untouchable for years. It's telling that even as the mob declined in influence in the late 20th century, the Costello model of diversification remained a talking point. Some capos urged younger members to think like Frank, to put money into real estate, restaurants, legitimate shipping companies, anything that could survive if the illegal rackets dried up. But the lure of fast cash from drugs and other high-profit crimes often overpowered that advice. Frank's own opinion on narcotics had always been clear: stay out. He believed drugs brought too much heat, too many long sentences, and too much chaos. The heroin trade was one of the key differences between his style and Genovese's. Vito saw the money and couldn't resist. Frank saw the risk and walked away. History vindicated him. Genovese ended up in prison for drug trafficking, while Frank spent his later years walking his gardens at Sands Point. His investments weren't without risk, of course. The slot machine business faced periodic crackdowns, and the racing wire became a target for law enforcement in the 1940s. But Frank's habit of keeping multiple income streams meant that no single setback could cripple him. By the late 1970s, his legitimate holdings had become his primary source of income. The mob connections still existed, but they were no longer essential to his survival. It was a position almost unheard of for a former boss, and it gave him a kind of freedom most in his world never knew. In the end, Frank Costello's business legacy wasn't just about how much money he made. It was about how he made it last. He treated wealth as a fortress, a buffer between himself and the chaos of the streets. And unlike so many of his peers, he never let ego drive him into risks that could jeopardize that fortress. It's why, decades after his death, his name still comes up in conversations about mob finance, not as the man who made the most, but as the man who made it last. By the time Frank Costello died in 1985, he was already more myth than man. His name had drifted from the police blotter into history books, documentaries, and the kind of late-night conversations where truth and legend mix until neither can be told apart. For the average New Yorker, Frank Costello was either a half-remembered name from the Kefauver hearings or a vague reference to that old gangster who dressed like a senator. But for the people who had known him, mobsters, politicians, journalists, cops, the image was more complicated. They'd each seen a different side of him, and those sides didn't always line up. The gentleman gangster myth. One of the strongest myths to emerge was the idea of Frank Costello as the ultimate gentleman gangster, the refined suit-wearing don who ran his empire with manners and diplomacy, never needing to resort to violence. It was a picture the press loved. It made him stand out from the cigar-chomping bruisers who dominated headlines in the mid-20th century. There was truth in it. Costello did prefer deals to bullets. He did cultivate an image of refinement, avoiding the public drunkenness and gaudy displays that made other mob bosses easy targets. But the myth often ignored a simple fact. Costello could be ruthless when he needed to be. Men disappeared on his watch. Rivals were quietly squeezed out of businesses. Judges who crossed him found themselves facing career-ending scandals. The difference was in the delivery. Costello didn't shout or threaten. He smiled, shook your hand, and made sure the next week you woke up to find your influence gone, your money frozen, and your allies silent. The reluctant boss story. Another popular story painted Costello as a man who never wanted to be a mob boss at all, that he had been forced into leadership after Luciano's imprisonment in the late 1930s. Some claimed he was happiest as a behind-the-scenes political fixer, and that taking the top spot was a reluctant duty. It's true that Frank thrived in the role of consigliere, the man who made things run smoothly. But reluctant? That's harder to believe. Power like that isn't something you fall into. When Luciano was gone, Costello moved into the seat without firing a shot, because he'd already positioned himself to be the only logical choice. The reluctant boss narrative was more useful to him alive than dead. It let him appear as a stabilizing figure, a caretaker, rather than an ambitious climber. But the truth is, no one sat in that chair without wanting to. The clean hands illusion. In interviews, Costello was fond of calling himself a businessman. He'd insist his money came from legitimate enterprises, and when reporters pressed, he'd shrug off their questions with a polite smile. That gave rise to the idea that he was somehow above the more sordid crimes of his peers. The reality was that his clean businesses, slot machines, real estate, liquor distribution, were built on mob money, mob protection, and mob muscle. He may not have personally broken legs or pulled triggers, but the threat of those things happening was the foundation under all his legitimate operations. The clean hands image worked, though. It gave politicians and businessmen cover to associate with him, and it kept some of the public willing to believe he was just another successful entrepreneur. The fearless survivor narrative. After the 1957 assassination attempt, another layer was added to the Costello legend, the fearless survivor. The story went that Vincent the Chin Gigante put a bullet in his head, and Costello just kept walking, barely flinching, before going back to his life as if nothing had happened. It's true he survived with nothing more than a graze, but fearless might be stretching it. The hit shook him deeply. It forced him to confront the reality that his political connections and low-key style weren't enough to protect him from ambitious rivals. The decision to step down afterward wasn't some act of casual disinterest. It was a calculated move to avoid a war he knew could kill him. The survivor narrative was good for his image, though. It made him seem invincible in the eyes of some, and in the mob world, appearances were everything. The political mastermind legend. Perhaps the most enduring part of Costello's reputation was his role as a political mastermind, the man who had the mayor's ear, who could sway judges, who could decide which laws were enforced and which weren't. This part was mostly true, but the legend made it seem like he could bend the entire city to his will with a phone call. In reality, his influence was more like a finely woven net, powerful when pulled from the right angle, but not all-encompassing. There were still prosecutors he couldn't reach, still investigations he couldn't kill. The danger of the political mastermind myth is that it ignored the constant maintenance it required. Costello didn't just have influence, he worked at it every day, meeting with people, smoothing egos, offering favors. It was a craft, not a magic trick. Pop culture's Costello. By the late 20th century, Costello had been absorbed into pop culture. Movies, TV shows, and novels borrowed pieces of his story. His mannerisms, his role as a mediator, his ability to move in both political and criminal circles. Some portrayals leaned into the gentleman gangster archetype, showing him as a calm, reasonable man in a violent world. Others exaggerated his political power to near-mythic levels, making him a puppet master behind the scenes of American government. The reality was somewhere between those extremes. He was influential, yes, but not omnipotent. And he was civilized in demeanor, but no stranger to coercion. How the myths served him. The most telling thing about all these myths is that many of them started while Costello was still alive, and he encouraged them. He understood the value of reputation as both shield and weapon. If people believed he preferred diplomacy, they were less likely to expect a sudden, ruthless move from him. If they thought he was untouchable politically, they were less likely to challenge him directly. Even after he stepped down in 1957, the myths helped keep him safe. A retired boss with a reputation for civility and political clout was a less attractive target than one remembered for bloodshed and vendettas. The problem with legends. The flip side of myth-making is that it can distort the real lessons. After his death, younger mobsters sometimes misunderstood Costello's example. They thought dressing well and speaking politely was the key to longevity, without understanding the decades of groundwork he'd laid in business, politics, and alliances. Others dismissed him entirely, seeing only the fact that he had walked away from power. In a culture where standing down was often equated with weakness, his choice was not universally respected. Fact and fiction, side by side. The truth about Frank Costello was this. He was a mob boss who ran one of the most powerful families in America with more subtlety than most, who built an empire that mixed legitimate and illegitimate business, who survived longer than almost anyone in his position, and who knew when to quit. The fiction was that he was above the mob's brutality, that he was a passive figurehead, or that he could bend the city to his will at any moment. Both versions, the fact and the fiction, kept him alive in memory. And maybe that was the ultimate Costello move, letting the myths do the work long after the man was gone. Frank Costello's public image was polished like the marble floor of his Sands Point estate, smooth, refined, impossible to scuff without great effort. But behind the image, behind the tailored suits and the political handshakes, there was a private life that very few people saw. Costello was a man who understood the value of secrecy, not just in business, but in the personal details that could be used against him. He never flaunted his home life the way some mob bosses did. He didn't fill his driveway with flashy cars or throw extravagant parties for hundreds of guests. His mansion was impressive, but not ostentatious, the sort of place that could just as easily have belonged to a successful banker or old-money industrialist. It had high ceilings, expensive furniture, manicured gardens, but no gold-plated chandeliers or garish fountains. Costello understood that subtle wealth was more powerful than loud wealth. Loretta, the constant. Loretta Geigerman Costello was, by all accounts, the only truly steady presence in Frank's life outside of business. They married in 1918, when Frank was still building his connections in East Harlem, and they stayed married until his death nearly 7 decades later. It wasn't the kind of marriage most people would recognize as traditional. Frank was discreet but not monastic. Rumors of girlfriends and quiet dalliances followed him for decades. Loretta knew the kind of man she'd married, and as long as the affairs didn't humiliate her publicly, she ignored them. In return, Frank gave her financial security, loyalty in the ways that mattered most to him, and a level of respect in public that other mob wives rarely enjoyed. Those close to them described Loretta as elegant but reserved, a woman who preferred quiet gatherings over the spotlight. She was intelligent, well-read, and perfectly capable of holding her own in a conversation with politicians or businessmen who assumed she was just a gangster's wife. Frank valued that. When she spoke in public settings, people listened, not because she was loud, but because she didn't waste words. Private routines. Frank was a creature of habit. Even in his busiest years, his days had structure. He rose early, often before sunrise, and read the morning papers while drinking strong black coffee. The New York Times for national and political news, the Daily News for the street pulse. He ate breakfast in the same spot every morning, the small table by the east-facing window in the kitchen where he could look out over the grounds. After breakfast, he would make calls from his study. The calls were brief, precise, and usually ended with some version of, "I'll see you about it," or "We'll talk later." Costello didn't like to do real business over the phone. Evenings were for company. Sometimes that meant dinner with Loretta, just the two of them. Other nights it was a handful of friends, trusted men from the old days, a politician or two, maybe a businessman whose project Frank was quietly backing. He believed in keeping the table small enough that one conversation could be heard without shouting. Hobbies and escapes. Costello didn't gamble heavily. Despite running gambling operations, he enjoyed cards but rarely played for high stakes. Losing money for sport was not in his nature. His real hobby was gardening. The grounds of Sands Point were his retreat, and he took an active role in maintaining them, not with his own hands most days, but by directing the gardeners and checking their work. He liked order in his surroundings. The hedges were trimmed, the lawns manicured, the flower beds symmetrical. It was a visual expression of how he liked his business. No chaos, no loose ends, everything in its place. He also enjoyed fine dining, but preferred it on his own terms. While other mob figures loved to be seen in famous restaurants, Costello liked private rooms, good wine, and long meals without interruptions. His taste in food leaned Italian, but with French influence, a reflection of his appreciation for refinement. Friendships and trust. Frank was cautious about calling anyone a friend. In his world, friendship and business were too intertwined to separate completely. Still, there were men he trusted implicitly, Meyer Lansky chief among them. Their bond was not just about mutual benefit, but genuine respect. Lansky admired Costello's political instincts, and Costello respected Lansky's business acumen. Even outside the mob, Frank cultivated relationships with certain businessmen and political figures who had nothing to do with his criminal ventures. These men might invite him to private clubs, golf courses, or discreet dinners, where the talk was as likely to be about world affairs as it was about New York politics. Temperament in private, those who only saw Costello in public might have assumed he was calm to the point of being unshakable. In truth, he had a temper, but it was slow to ignite and carefully controlled. He didn't shout or throw glasses, he simply went quiet, his eyes narrowing, his words becoming shorter and sharper. Those moments, his inner circle knew, were more dangerous than any outburst. One associate recalled that Frank's way of expressing anger was to end a meeting early. He wouldn't yell, he'd just say, "That's enough for today," and walk out. And you knew, you'd better fix whatever you'd just done wrong. The importance of privacy. Frank's obsession with privacy bordered on paranoia, but it was also what kept him alive. He hated being photographed, avoided unnecessary publicity, and never gave out personal details unless there was a reason. Even his close associates sometimes didn't know exactly where he would be on a given night. The Sands Point estate was designed with that in mind. The long driveway kept unexpected visitors visible before they reached the house. Rooms were arranged to allow for private conversations out of earshot of staff. Doors closed quietly but firmly. Even in retirement, he lived as if someone might be watching. And in truth, someone usually was. Law enforcement surveillance never entirely let him go. The human side. For all his calculating nature, Frank did have a softer side that appeared in private. He was known to be generous to friends and family, quietly paying medical bills, tuition, or rent without making a show of it. He loved animals, particularly dogs, and often had one or two at the estate. He also had a sense of humor, dry and understated. Guests at dinner would sometimes be caught off guard by a perfectly timed remark that cut through the tension in a room. Frank liked making people laugh, but not in a way that undercut his authority. Balancing two worlds. Perhaps the most remarkable thing about Frank Costello's private life was how seamlessly it coexisted with his public role. He could spend the afternoon tending to roses and the evening brokering a deal between rival mob factions. He could host a Sunday lunch with Loretta and friends, then take a call that subtly influenced city policy. He understood that the key to survival wasn't just in outmaneuvering enemies, it was in building a life that gave him reasons to survive in the first place. For Frank, that meant creating a home and a daily rhythm that insulated him from the constant grind of the life. It also meant having something to retreat into when the pressure became too much. After the 1957 hit attempt, Sands Point became that refuge more than ever. There, away from the city, he could pretend for a few hours that he was just another successful man in his later years, not a figure whose name still carried weight in the underworld. Final years in private. In his final years, Frank's private world shrank even further. Health problems slowed him, and his guest list became even more selective. Loretta remained at his side, and the few who were welcomed into the house noticed how much quieter he'd become. The sharp mind was still there, but the urgency was gone. When he died in 1985, many of the people who attended his funeral had never been inside his home. Even in death, the lines between Frank Costello, the public figure, and Frank Costello, the private man, remained sharply drawn. Frank Costello's story was not just the story of one man, it was the story of an era. From the crumbling tenements of East Harlem at the turn of the 20th century to the marbled halls of political power and the shadowy rooms where the commission made its decisions, Costello had walked a path few could survive. He hadn't been the most feared boss, he hadn't been the richest, but he had been the one who understood better than almost anyone that in organized crime, the real power was in making yourself indispensable. From the streets to the commission, the boy who came to America from Calabria grew up in a city divided by ethnicity, poverty, and opportunity measured in inches. Early on, Costello understood that fists and bullets could win a block, but only influence could win a city. By his teens, he was already moving in circles that blurred the lines between politics and crime. Prohibition turned those blurred lines into highways. While others fought over territory with shotguns and headlines, Costello carved out his niche, the middleman who could keep the booze flowing, the cops looking the other way, and the politicians on his side. It was that skill set, more than his earnings from bootlegging, that earned him a seat beside Lucky Luciano and Meyer Lansky. When Luciano was imprisoned and later deported, Costello slid into the leadership role without firing a single shot. That was his style. Power gained quietly, without fanfare. He wasn't a general marching into battle. He was the man who rearranged the board while everyone else was looking at the wrong game. The Prime Minister's rule. As boss, Costello avoided the blood-soaked headlines that drew unwanted attention. His meetings were in hotel suites, private dining rooms, and quiet offices, not smoky social clubs with a constant parade of soldiers. His rackets, slot machines, the racing wire, gambling, were chosen not for the adrenaline rush, but for their steady, sustainable income. He ran his family like a business with himself as the CEO. His board of directors wasn't just capos and underbosses. It was judges, politicians, police captains, and businessmen. For 2 decades, this approach worked. Costello kept the peace between the 5 families, built fortunes, and maintained political influence so strong that newspapers nicknamed him the Prime Minister of the Underworld. The fall without the crash. But power always breeds rivals. For Vito Genovese, Costello's diplomacy looked like weakness. Genovese wanted the old ways, control through fear, dominance through violence, and the new rivers of money flowing from narcotics. The 1957 hit attempt by Vincent the Chin Gigante was the culmination of that rivalry. The bullet didn't kill Costello, but it wounded the armor of invincibility he'd worn for years. And in perhaps his most telling move, he didn't respond with a counterstrike. Instead, he stepped back, allowing Genovese to take the throne without sparking a war. It was an unthinkable decision for most mob bosses, but Costello's calculus was simple: better to live without the crown than die defending it. Life after power. Unlike so many who leave leadership in the mob, Costello didn't fade into poverty or irrelevance. His decades of diversification, real estate, legitimate businesses, investments, gave him independence from the street. His political connections still existed, if quieter now. And at Sands Point, with Loretta by his side, he built a life that allowed him to watch the game from the sidelines without being in it. He lived nearly 3 more decades after retirement, a span that let him see the mob's golden years collapse under RICO indictments, informants, and the erosion of the old code. From the outside, he rarely commented, but those who knew him say he had little patience for the flashy, reckless bosses of the later years. The lessons of Costello's life. Costello's legacy offers hard lessons for anyone trying to understand power in the underworld. Influence is stronger than intimidation. Guns kill men, but influence kills problems. Costello knew how to use the system to his advantage, bending it without always breaking it. Diversify or die. He understood that criminal rackets were volatile. His legitimate businesses weren't just fronts, they were safety nets. Control the image. From his tailored suits to his careful public statements, Costello curated a persona that kept him above the common thug in the public eye. Know when to walk away. His decision to step down rather than fight Genovese may have been controversial, but it bought him something no mob boss values until it's almost gone: time. Relationships are the real currency. Money opened doors, but loyalty and usefulness kept them open. Costello invested in people as much as in businesses. The end of an era. When Costello died in 1985, the mob was already in decline. The commission trial was around the corner. Gotti's flamboyance would soon draw a level of public and law enforcement attention that made Costello's low-profile approach look prophetic. And the city itself had changed. Political machines were weaker, the press hungrier, and the old neighborhoods that had fed recruits into the mob were changing under economic shifts and new waves of immigration. His funeral was small compared to the spectacle some mob bosses received. There were no endless motorcades of limousines, no public displays of muscle. Instead, it was attended by a mix of old friends, family, and the last of his contemporaries, men who knew the value of keeping things quiet, even in death. The legacy. He left today. Frank Costello is remembered in 3 main ways: by the underworld, as the boss who made it to the finish line without going to prison for life or being murdered. Some saw that as genius, others as proof he lacked the stomach for a fight. By historians, as a transitional figure, the bridge between the old-world gangsters of the early 1900s and the corporate-style crime syndicates that followed. By popular culture, as the archetype of the gentleman gangster, a man whose power came from his ability to move in high society as easily as on the street. Each version contains a piece of the truth. The man behind the title. For all the myths, Frank Costello remained at his core a pragmatist. He didn't romanticize the life. He didn't pretend it was noble. He understood its risks and its rewards, and played the long game with a discipline most of his peers lacked. His life wasn't built on the thrill of the score. It was built on the security of knowing he could still enjoy the next one. In that way, he wasn't just the prime minister of the mob. He was its most successful survivor. Final reflection. History tends to celebrate the loud, the dramatic, the violent. But in organized crime, as in politics, the real winners are often the quiet ones. The men who leave the room without a scar, but with everyone else, wondering how they still hold the strings. Frank Costello walked away from the life still alive, still wealthy, and still in control of his own story. And that, perhaps, is the most dangerous kind of power, the kind that doesn't need to be proven, only remembered.